Random House Audiobooks presents An Album of Memories, Personal Histories from the Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw. Read for you by Tom Brokaw and a cast of actors.
An Album of Memories, Personal Histories from the Greatest Generation. Forward. For the past 3 years, I have been immersed in the stories of what I call the Greatest Generation, those American men and women who came of age in the Great Depression, served at home and abroad during World War II, and then built the nation we have today. In 2 books, The Greatest Generation and The Greatest Generation Speaks, I documented their stories of bravery and sacrifice, achievement and humility, loyalty and service. The reaction to these books has been deeply gratifying. Members of that generation characteristically are modest and yet quietly proud of what they have achieved individually and collectively, and proud also to have had their accomplishments recognized at this stage of their lives. In turn, their children and grandchildren tell me they are re-examining their own lives and values, measuring them against the legacy of their parents and grandparents. It is a kind of symbiotic effect in which the generations, by interacting, are giving new meaning to their lives. It was a common trait of the Greatest Generation not to discuss the difficult times and how they shaped their lives. But now, in their twilight years, more and more members of that remarkable group of men and women are determined to share their experiences. Frankly, when the second book was finished, I thought we had exhausted the supply of fresh material, but the stories keep coming in, describing history as it was lived by ordinary people, on D-Day, on Bataan, during the Battle of Midway, and so on. I have come to realize that here are still so many stories to be told, so many lessons to be learned from even the briefest recollections of that time of deprivation and war, heroism and belief, uncertainty and peril. So this album of memories is a way of celebrating more of those lives and preserving their memories and stories. It is designed to complement the earlier books and also the new World War II memorial in Washington, D.C. Part of the proceeds from the sale of An Album of Memories will be dedicated to the work of the memorial. Again, I am deeply indebted to the men and women whose stories you will find here, and to the children and friends who offered their reflections as well. Part 1. From the Depression to Pearl Harbor. Between 1929 and the end of World War II in 1945, the world was in economic, political, military, and cultural turmoil on a scale unprecedented in recorded history. Earlier periods of great disruption brought on by the ambitions of the Roman Empire, or Genghis Khan, the bubonic plague in Europe, or the changing of a dynasty in China were largely regional events. But by the third decade of the 20th century, air and sea transportation, communications technology, the telephone and radio, and trade had made the world a much smaller place, where regional events had global ramifications. As the United States would learn in painful and costly fashion, the presence of 2 great oceans, East and West, did not insulate America from the ravages of economic chaos, the cruelty of nature, and the winds of far-off wars. The American stock market collapse in 1929 was the beginning of a radical change of fortune for the United States, and it coincided with the rise of sinister political forces in the heart of Europe and in Asia. In Europe, Adolf Hitler was plotting to take over Germany with his National Socialist Party, the Nazis. In Asia, Japan was preparing to extend its political and military ambitions well beyond that tiny island nation. To the average American, however, those distant developments were of little consequence, when measured against the frightening state of the U.S. economy. The numbers were staggering. In 3 years, stocks lost 80% of their value. The Ford Motor Company employed 128,000 workers in 1929. By 1931, that number had dropped to 37,000. American farmers who had sold a bushel of corn for 77 cents in 1929 were getting only 32 cents a bushel by 1932. By then, the American economy was in a free fall. The sad effect was a plague of unemployment, bankruptcy, foreclosure, and broken dreams, from Wall Street to Main Street and beyond. Zelpha Simmons writes about the hardships her family faced during those years. Just a teenager at the time, Simmons took a full-time job as a bookkeeper, earning $15 a week. The only wage earner for a family of 5, her family, quote, made it with a milk cow, garden, and chickens, and hard work. A patrician confined to a wheelchair, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the 1932 Democratic presidential nomination to run against the incumbent Herbert Hoover, a brilliant engineer who had had a distinguished career in public service and in the private sector before he entered the White House just in time for the calamities that led to the Great Depression. As FDR was awaiting his inauguration in 1933, Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of the German Republic. In the United States, small and large banks were collapsing. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1933, the new president assured a national radio audience, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Given what was to come, it was an especially bold and inspirational affirmation of the new leadership in the White House. When President Roosevelt set out to rebuild the American spirit and economy with what he promised was a New Deal, he could not ignore the ominous developments in Europe and Asia. As the 1930s wore on, tensions rose around the globe. The inability of the League of Nations to respond to the Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931 weakened the organization. The League ordered Japan to withdraw from Manchuria in 1933. Instead, Japan withdrew from the League. In 1933, Germany withdrew from a disarmament conference, then from the League itself. By 1934, Austrian Nazis seemed poised to reconnect Germany and Austria. On July 25, the Austrian Prime Minister, Engelbert Dollfuss, was assassinated by Austrian Nazis. Italy, not yet a German ally, rushed its troops to the Austrian border, and a show of force prevented the Union. In 1935, Hitler began to rebuild the German Army, Navy, and Air Force. It was widely known that Germany was violating the arms limitation clauses of the Treaty of Versailles that had ended World War I. Still, German aggression went unchecked. In 1936, Hitler gambled on the Western unwillingness to fight and sent troops into the Rhineland. The French and British did nothing. Meanwhile, the Italians practiced aggression of their own. A skirmish in the desert in December 1934 served as public pretext for the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935. The League of Nations responded by prohibiting the sale of war materials to Italy, and while most countries went along with the embargo and it caused some hardship, the war did not stop. Oil, the most important item of all, had been left off the list of embargoed items. Ethiopia was defeated in 1936 and combined with Italian Somaliland and Eritrea into an Italian East African empire. Spain, too, proved to be a flashpoint. In 1936, a group of military men led by Francisco Franco mounted an insurrection against a legally elected Republican government, and the country descended into a civil war that would cost more than 500,000 lives. In Great Britain, Winston Churchill, deep in the political wilderness, was increasingly alarmed and characteristically pugnacious in his warnings to the English.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?